Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Unscripted History, where today I'll be going over the assault on Izmail, or Izmail Fortress, which happened on December 22nd, 1790. Now, yes, this is a part of the greater siege of Izmail, which lasted from December 11th, 1790 to December 22nd, 1790, but I'm going to predominantly focus on the assault because it's kind of the interesting part, but I will give a brief preface. So, Izmail. This fortress was known as Impenetrable, and the Russian forces were trying to take it because it was going on during the Russo-Turkish War, and also, I guess, kind of coinciding with the Austro-Turkish War. And so the Russians were dire on taking this fortress because it was an important spot. And it had been attempted to be taken 4 times prior, yet each of those attempts failed. So the Russians were kind of jaded at the commandant of Izmail, whose name was crap, I'm going to obliterate this. It's like Iodulus Pasha. It's Iodulus Mehmed Pasha. I'm going to say Pasha. But yeah, so he was one of the greatest generals amongst the Turkish forces, and he ruled over Izmail. However, once time progressed, we ultimately get to the siege of Izmail, where a new commander is thrown at this impenetrable fortress by the name of Alexander Suvorov. So Suvorov, he took this a little bit differently. He decided to combine the use of a flotilla and a on-ground force, obviously. So he was combining artillery, the flotilla, so I guess aquatic forces, and then, like I said, foot soldiers, stuff like that. So we see as the siege lasts for 11 days. Now, at first, the citizens of Izmail are like, oh, we probably need to, get going and, make peace with the Russians. However, as the time progressed on, they're like, no, we need to stand our ground. And that's what they ultimately ended up doing, because we see as we get to December 22nd, 1790, where at 3 a.m. the Russian forces start preparing to attack, and then by 5:30 the assault on the walls of Izmail begins. Now, we see as multiple forces are sent out, and multiple of them fell. I believe specifically about 3 of the planned, pronged attacks on the walls of Izmail fail. We actually see that even one of the generals who later becomes very important in this story, Kutuzov, his attack failed, but we see as this progresses, and they keep fighting for the wall, struggling, until ultimately at 8 o'clock, only 2 hours and 30 minutes after the beginning of the assault, they are able to take the walls of this impenetrable force, which is absurdly impressive. But this was not the hard part. The hard part was what came after 8 a.m., because once they actually got into the walls, this is where the onslaught began, because the Turks were very against and very begrudgingly, well, not even very begrudgingly, they were absolutely unwilling to give up Izmail. So they fought for every square inch of land, blood everywhere, because they were not going to let Izmail fall. They fought to their last breath. The, perseverance of the Turkish forces in this battle is truly admirable. And so we see as they are fighting for every inch. We even see as Suvorov has to bring in 20 light cannons to clear the streets more easily, because there is that much fighting going on and that many Turkish forces willing to fight. Now, I'll kind of discuss, I forgot to mention at the beginning of this, the amount of soldiers for each force. Now, the Russians, I believe, had about 31,000, and they were the sieging force. They're going to obviously lose. If they take it smart, they're going to lose less now in a siege. If you don't take it smart, you're going to lose a lot more. But the Ottoman forces had them substantially outnumbered with a 42,000-man force. So they are fighting tooth and nail with technically a lesser number of men again in this city, and they're fighting against someone on their own ground within their own city. Yet the Russians are able to push them back. We see as time progresses, ultimately, one of the Turkish leaders by the name of, it's Qaplan, Kaplan Gere, ultimately ends up scrounging up a bunch of forces from within this fortress in Izmail. He scrounges up about 3,000 to 4,000 forces, and is able to start fighting back against the Russians a little bit. He's actually able to do some pretty decent damage. However, he is ultimately defeated, and multiple members of his family are killed or captured. So we see as this battle just continues to progress, a very, very bloody conflict. And so this lasts until 4 p.m. So that is a 11 and a half hours, no, not 11 and a half hour span, oh my gosh, why am I blanking? 10 and a half hour span. So, this 10 and a half hour span, the Russian forces are able to take this impenetrable fortress that has not been taken by 4 prior generals in just 10 hours and 30 minutes almost. That is crazy. However, sadly, the bloodshed did not end here. So, we saw after this as the Russian soldiers ran rampant within the fortress of Izmail, because, as was custom, Alexander Suvorov had promised the soldiers 3 days to do whatever they wanted in the city, and then ultimately he would reestablish, I guess, peace and stability. Not necessarily peace, but stability. And so we see as the Russian soldiers go wild. They are absolutely belligerent because they have so much built-up animosity for the previous losses and defeats that have happened to Izmail and the 11-day siege which had happened this prior, that they are unwilling to be gracious or, I guess, forgiving. And they slaughter everyone. Any men they find, they're killed. If any wounded are found, they're killed. Well, the wounded weren't killed. The wounded were captured. But they're killed. Children, women are killed. And obviously, you know, the other things which soldiers do once they're raiding a city like this. And so we see as this city is absolutely ransacked. We see as everything's pillaged, jewelry, riches, entire buildings are taken over the corpses of their masters and all that, or the corpses of the previous owners. And it is just ransacked. There is nothing left essentially after this. And so we see as this continues, like I said, for the 3 days until ultimately Suvorov once again reinstates and is able to rile everyone in. However, this is not without its consequences, because we then see as due to this, we also did see, obviously, prior, a lot of Russians died within, but some Russians were murdered because of the actions they were partaking in once they had actually taken the city. So, in the end, there's varying numbers. It's believed that casualty-wise, so including wounded and killed, there were 4,500 to 10,000 Russians who were killed or wounded. And it's guessed more so that there was 1,800 that were killed. However, the Turkish forces fared a lot worse. So, amongst the Turkish forces, there was 42,000 people. Now, it is presumed that 26,000 were killed, 9,000 were captured, and others were also captured or wounded and captured. And it is declared from some sources that there was only one Turkish soldier who was able to escape capture or death. That is how brutal the onslaught at Izmail was. The Russians absolutely decimated Izmail. And like I said, it was predominantly fueled by their just animosity toward the Turkish for what they had done to the previous 4 armies that had attempted to take Izmail and the, 11-day siege that they had been undergoing. But yeah, so Izmail was utterly obliterated. It was so bad that they had to dispose of the corpses, because if you don't dispose of corpses, they rot, they release stench into the air, and bacteria, obviously, and this leads to infection. So they did not want the people of Izmail getting sick, or at least the higher-ups didn't, because I bet the soldiers didn't really care, because they hated the people of Izmail. However, the higher-ups wanted to control the city and actually benefit from it, so they ordered for all of the bodies to be thrown out. However, there were so many bodies that not all of them could be burned, or not burned, but buried. So you know what they did? They went and threw it in the Danube River, because of course we're going to throw corpses in our source of water. But yeah, so they started throwing them in the Danube, and it literally took 6 whole days to get all the corpses out of Izmail. Even with the assistance of slaves, or not slaves, but prisoners of war, and the actual soldiers. That is how long it took to get all of the corpses out of Izmail. There was that many. Now, Izmail does, in fact, have quite a decent legacy, because this was a massive victory for the Russian forces, and ultimately did end up leading to the end, or at least eventually leading to the end of the Russo-Turkish War in 1791. But also, it was a very unique military attack, because it really showed a development within military strategy, because prior to this, we had seen some, but it had not been common to see a quick siege followed by a aggressive assault afterwards, because this was only an 11-day siege. That is very short in terms of sieges, and it was quick, and then they hammered down on the Ismaili, or at least the Turkish forces, actually. But yeah, so that was actually one of the cool benefits. But also one of the cool things about it was that it was, amphibious, because it was both land and water fighting, because they used the flotilla to barrage the walls and stuff like that, and they also used the land forces, obviously, to go over the walls and capture the walls and capture the gates, which were obviously in the walls of the city. So yeah, that was just really cool to see how this development happened. Also, we saw as a couple more Russian officers became quite distinguished, with Suvorov even getting recognition from Catherine II, who was Tsar of Russia at the time, or Tsarina. It's either Tsaress or Tsarina. I know Tsarina. I think Tsarina is the wife of the Tsar. I guess, a czaress. I'm just going to call her Czar because she was the Czar. But yeah, so he even got recognition from Catherine II, getting a very high honor. And then, I believe he also got, it was specifically the Lieutenant General of, like, not the Lieutenant General, Lieutenant Colonel of this specific order of guard that Catherine was actually a leading member of. But yeah, so saw that. And also we get to see that Kutuzov is, Kutuzov, that's his name, was actually recognized by Suvorov because of his good actions. Even though he did fail at his attack on the wall, he was actually recognized here, and he was given the position of commandant over the city of Izmail after the 3-day ransacking. So that's just really cool to see these very deserving Russian officers get recognized like they should. Now, I mean, it is a little bit debatable, but for Kutuzov to get recognized like this, but also it is stated that he deserved it, and if it had been because of the Russian forces and all of that were commanded under them, that most of them would have died. But yeah, so that's all there really is for the general history on the Siege of Izmail. Now, like I said, that wasn't really a whole siege. I just gave some brief background and focused more on the assault because the assault is honestly the interesting part of it. But yeah, so that's all there really is for that, and thank you very much for watching.